Hello and welcome to this OECD webinar with me, Duncan Crawford. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we're discussing how to create inclusive classrooms for children with special education needs. How can we ensure that every child feels valued and supported in the classroom? We're going to explore strategies and best practices to do just that, to support all learners, including those with dyslexia, autism, ADHD, and other diverse learning needs. We're going to have a panel of guests to discuss all this in a moment, but first up, we're going to hear from OECD Policy Analyst Cecilia Mezzanotte, who works on the Education for Inclusive Societies project. She's going to give some opening remarks. Over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you, Duncan. Let me just share my slides and we can get started. I'll be just providing a short overview of the work that we've been doing here at the Department of Education over the last few years. And let me see if I can share this well. Just one sec. Let me switch. Okay, can you see it correctly?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Duncan. So just to give you an overview of the work we've been doing for the last few years in the Education for Inclusive Societies project now and before in the Strength Through Diversity project. So we have been working extensively on inclusion in education over all these years. So the definition that we use for inclusion is that the UNESCO developed in 2009. So we define inclusion in education as a process that is aimed at offering quality education for all while respecting diversity, different needs and abilities, characteristics, and learning expectations, not only for the students, but also for their families and communities. And the way in which we understand diversity includes a number of different groups and also two overarching factors that characterize all students, which is their socioeconomic status and their geographic location. So whether they live in a rural or in an urban community. Special education needs are one of the groups that we focus on a lot over the years. And while there is not really a generalized consensus across OECD countries on what are special education needs, which groups specifically are under this category, there is an understanding that there is a very big role for education to play to ensure that all students are included, and in particular, students with special education needs. And we know that the definitions vary. They depend on whether countries provide condition-specific categorization, whether they use labels at all. And some countries have very, very specific case-by-case approaches, while others have very detailed listings of which groups of students are considered as having special education needs. And this can change a lot. So in some countries, it's just students that have a diagnosis of a certain disorder or an impairment. And in other countries, it might include also socioeconomic disadvantage or language difficulties. So to go through this work and give an understanding of what we think when we're talking about special education needs, we identified three subgroups that we normally refer to, and that is learning disabilities, physical impairments, and mental disorders. This is not gonna match exactly what other countries and other systems are doing, but it's just to provide you with a sense of what we're talking about when we specifically talk about special education needs. The challenges that we see that there are, that the literature suggests when we talk about special education needs in education and beyond, are several. So we see there are academic barriers often. So students with SEN tend to have lower academic achievement, completion rate, tertiary education completion, but they also tend to have higher reported rates of bullying compared to their peers. And we have concerns in the literature about their emotional well-being. They are being at risk of abuse and social exclusion in a lot of different contexts. At the same time, there are limited opportunities for peer interaction when students are in segregated setting, and that can also reduce the opportunities to create bonds between different groups of students. And this is not valid, of course, only for students with SEN. This is a general understanding that we have for inclusive education and also for other groups. And from the literature, we see that there are some benefits both for students with SEN and for students that do not have special education needs in mainstream and inclusive education. So in general, the literature showed that there are better academic outcomes in mainstream schools that have an inclusive education system and a quality education system as well. They tend to improve their language, literacy skills, and behavior. Of course, some of these findings I'm mentioning are specific to certain studies and certain groups, but I'm going to give you references at the end so you can look a bit more in detail. And also, we see a higher education enrollment that goes up for students that are in inclusive settings. For their peers, we see that there are not really problems in terms of how these more inclusive setting impact their own academic outcomes. We know that that is a concern in a lot of situations, and we talk more about it later, but there is not really much evidence that says that this is a problem for other students. Plus, we know that exposure to differences and to diversity can reduce prejudice, fear, and discrimination. In terms of other effects that we see in the literature, we see that low achieving students, even if they don't have special education needs, tend to benefit from the adapted and flexible learning that they can find in inclusive settings, but also that there is a bit of evidence that very high achieving students might face slightly negative effects to their performance in inclusive settings, probably because there is not enough capacity to differentiate instruction enough on them. But there is also work on gifted education in case you're interested in this. Beyond education, we see there are higher costs and barriers for individuals with special education needs and disabilities. So they tend to face lower earnings, and their families tend to have higher caregiving and medical costs throughout their lives. And people with disabilities are often overrepresented in justice and welfare systems. However, we have also seen the evidence is not as extensive as we would love. But we have some initial evidence that suggests that inclusive education can improve employment rates for the individuals that go through more inclusive setting in their academic path. They tend to bring higher wages. And also, we know that early intervention can reduce long-term costs. So if we support students to perform and achieve their potential, we in turn can have a reduction of welfare costs, healthcare expenses, and we avoid having lost productivity and income for societies. So there is also a socioeconomic rationale to inclusion as societies, and not only a discussion in terms of human rights or attention just to the educational path of the students. And to give you an idea of how we analyze these issues normally in our work, we had identified 5 policy areas that we analyzed. So we go through the governance, resourcing, capacity development of a system. We looked into the school level interventions and also in the monitoring and evaluation of equity and inclusion. And this is applied to all the topics that we analyze in the field of special education needs. We have a paper on ADHD, for instance, that you might be interested in. And we focus on the governance, so which requirements different countries have for providing support to the students. Do they use label? Do they not? How does the resourcing work? In terms of capacity development, we have looked into whether there is initial education, initial training for teachers, whether there is in-service or continuous professional development. And also another element that we tend to look into normally is the awareness raising, in the way that we are very interested in whether all the stakeholders around the education system are supporting inclusion or not. And then we looked more at the very school level intervention. So we compared which guidelines and provisions countries have towards students with ADHD and what the literature says on what works and what works less well for them. And just to give you an idea of upcoming work in this field, so there are going to be a few papers coming out in the next couple of years. We're going to have one soon on artificial intelligence and inclusive education that is going to focus a lot on whether and how artificial intelligence can be useful to support inclusion of students with SEN, one on multi-tier systems of support in education. Next year, we're going to focus also on students with autism quite a bit, and we plan to follow that paper on one on behavioral issues in classroom, which is an issue that we heard has been catching the attention of a lot of our countries. At the same time, we are planning to do a peer learning activities with the countries that are interested in it. The idea here is to share experiences, challenges, and find solutions together on how to mainstream effectively students with SEN in more inclusive education systems, see what are the barriers there, and how we can all solve them together, depending on the characteristics of each country. So we have done quite a bit of work in this area. I'm not going to go in detail now, but as you see, and you're going to see the links in the chat, we have several papers on several of these topics, going from ADHD, SEN in general, the rationale of inclusion, building capacity for the teachers, and a general report on equity and inclusion in education, which includes work on SEN, but also looks into all the other groups that we normally focus on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Cecilia. Good to see you setting homework there for everyone watching at home or in the office. So there you have it. Lots of interesting information there. And thank you to so many of you for joining us. I can see in the chat, it's very active already. Hello to Hyun Jong from South Korea, Gulhan from Turkey's National Ministry of Education, Ron John from India, Laura from Scotland. There's so many of you joining us. It truly is a global webinar. So thank you so much for being part of this. If you do have any questions about what Cecilia was just talking about, or for our panelists who I'm about to introduce, then please do use the chat function at the bottom of your screens and send those questions in. I will get through as many of those as possible. Now, though, I think it's probably a good time to introduce our panel. Joining us today, Kate Griggs, founder and CEO of the global charity Made in Dyslexia, and Sam Pittis, a broadcaster, journalist, and co-host of the podcast You're Wrong About ADHD. Hello to our two other panelists. Thank you so much for joining me today. I want to start by asking about the situation at the moment in schools and other education establishments. How inclusive are classrooms in general at the moment? Do children with special education needs in general get the support they need? Kate Griggs, founder of Made in Dyslexia, what do you think?
I think there are pockets of amazing practice, and there are larger pockets of not good practice. I think it's primarily because special educational needs is such a big topic that a lot of schools and teachers feel that it's a really big thing to do, and it tends to be an afterthought, sadly. Whereas inclusion is what should be happening in every classroom, because certainly with dyslexic learners, almost every dyslexic child can thrive in a classroom where teachers understand dyslexia, not just from the strengths and not just from the challenges, but also really understand the strengths. So I think there's lots of amazing stuff happening, but there's an awful long way to go before we actually create truly inclusive classrooms.
And because lots of the people watching won't know you necessarily, can you tell us a bit about your personal story and about how you got involved in this?
Yes, sure. So I'm dyslexic, and I have, well, almost my entire family are dyslexic too. I was lucky enough after a very ropey start at school, where I just felt that I was stupid and really not achieving. I was sent to a mainstream school that supported dyslexia. This was back in the late 70s, mid to late 70s. So and literally, my life transformed from teachers who understood dyslexia, understood the challenges, understood the strengths, and allowed me to thrive in that inclusive classroom. So we have actually known for many, many decades what dyslexic children need. Dyslexia comes with this pattern of strengths and challenges. I started my campaigning when my son was struggling at school, kind of 30 odd years later, and I couldn't believe that the education system hadn't caught up with my school, which at the time was quite forward thinking. So that's why I've started Made by Dyslexia. We're a global charity, and our mission is to teach the world the brilliance of dyslexic thinking and empower it in every home, every school, every workplace. And we've produced lots of free training for teachers and parents to help to do that.
Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us. Sam Pittis, let me bring you in. You're a professional broadcaster by trade, but you've also been diagnosed with ADHD, and you now host this or co-host this podcast, You're Wrong About ADHD. Tell us a little about your experience at school.
I think school was one of the question marks for me that probably led me to getting diagnosed later in life, because my school experience, to put not too fine a point on it, was traumatic. I mean, I hated school. It felt like a prison. I felt like I was sort of boiling. I could just have this sense of being squashed down. There was a sense of thinking I'm being told to do things that I just can't take in, that I just can't stomach, and it's not just a case of, well, I can't really be bothered. It was sort of a physical reaction to being told what I had to do at school. And I can remember at quite a young age having a sense that I'm in school and I'm going to be here for another 12 years and that there's no way out. And that at a young age creates a lot of negative feelings about yourself, about the environment that you're in. And I think when I was older, I look back at that experience and thought, was that normal? Is that what everybody goes through? And it led me, when I was 37, to be diagnosed with ADHD, which then explained what all those feelings were about. Now, part of the podcast that we've done, You're Wrong About ADHD, is trying to figure out exactly what is ADHD, what does, those experiences that I had, what do they mean, and what's the picture like now? And from lots of the experts we've spoken to, and anecdotally from parents too, it is a very different environment now. There is a lot more awareness about ADHD, but the provision for helping children with ADHD, certainly here in the UK, is still quite patchy. It varies greatly. There are schools that absolutely get it right. It's supposed to be, support is supposed to be offered on a needs basis. So a child presents with an issue or is struggling at school, they are offered support irrespective of whether they've got a diagnosis. But you still hear from parents who will say, I went to the school, I asked for help, and the school said, well, unless you've got an ADHD diagnosis, there's nothing we can do.
And speaking to the experts you do on that podcast, what are they telling you? Why is it so patchy, the services around the country?
Well, I think there are three main issues, really, certainly in terms of ADHD. I mean, first, it is awareness, and awareness has increased greatly, but I still think there is a misunderstanding about what ADHD is. I think then, obviously, there's a question of resources. There are lots of teachers doing fabulous work, but if you've got an average of 30 children in a class with one teaching assistant, there is a limit to the support you can offer. So there is awareness, there's resources, but there's also a cultural issue. And I think that is the biggest thing here in the UK. And maybe that's something we can sort of tease out further in this conversation, is that we still have a knowledge-based, information-based education system where children are being taught lots of information. They're expected to take it all in. They're expected to sort of sit quietly and write and learn to read and learn their maths. And actually, we know that people with ADHD brains often don't learn in that way. And often they are better stimulated in creative ways, and their creative brains are better encouraged with other forms of learning.
Thank you for that, Sam. Let me bring Cecilia Mezzanotte back in to get a bit more of a global perspective, because we've heard about the UK there, about dyslexia and ADHD, but in terms of other special education needs globally, Sam's saying it's fairly patchy where he's based, but what was it like globally?
I think that's a common challenge for a lot of OECD countries. So what we've been hearing is that it's complicated for countries, also the ones that have been trying to go more and more towards an inclusive system to ensure that every student that has a special education need receives the support that they need in classrooms. And there are countries that do a better job or a different job from others. So they have very different understanding of what inclusion means. So their whole education system has been developed to respond to that definition. So there are some countries that have made it so that all their students receive support in the classroom, regardless of whether they have a diagnosis, regardless of what their category is in a way, while others are trying to provide very targeted, specialized supports in students in separated contexts. And they try to give them the support that they need. And of course, both sides have challenges in managing these issues. But of course, there are some examples that are particularly intriguing. So we've seen that in Portugal, there has been a huge reform over the past few years. So they started in 2018. They changed completely the legislation on the topic, and they reorganized their education system, closing all special schools, having all students in mainstream education, and then using special education teachers as resources for all other teachers. Because one issue that we see is that a lot of the time the teachers don't have the training, the time, the resources, the capacity to support all the students. So the former special education teachers support them in learning how to do that, how to do this in this our classroom where we have this problem and we don't know how to tackle. So we see that there are a lot of efforts in trying to make these stronger in certain countries. That's also the case in New Brunswick, in Canada. They've been investing quite a bit in the area, in New Zealand, in Scotland. So there are very interesting examples, but it's a struggle for a lot of teachers when they are in the classroom, as Sam was saying, with a lot of students and not that many resources to support them.
How big an issue is that you've seen a number of students being diagnosed with ADHD, but also those diagnosed with autism, spectrum disorder increasing in recent years. So where's the funding or where's the expertise in the schools to ensure that teachers are trained and can handle those situations?
That's a big challenge, I think, that a lot of countries are seeing. So the number of diagnoses have been going up. Research is looking into the drivers. For now, a lot of the research says we were just missing a lot of children before. So we were not diagnosing girls with ADHD or autism a lot before. So now that's coming up much more. The numbers are increasing. And a lot of countries are wondering then, we have recognized these needs, we recognize these students, how do we support the teachers in the classrooms? So in certain cases, there have been these resource centers, for instance, that have been developed to support the teachers in the classes, that have been training provided by regional authorities or by central authorities so that the teachers can try and get up to speed on how to support different students. But it's been a challenge. And we also see that parents are very concerned that teachers do not have the means to support their children. And that in turn basically brought them to wanting more separated or specialized settings. So we've seen a trend of special classes increasing a lot in a number of countries. And that is also driven by the request of the parents this time. So there is a tension on how to do that best. We, in general, suggest that more inclusive settings are better, but they do require additional resources for the teachers and the schools to be effective. So we understand why families might be concerned in a mainstream setting where they see, well, we're not really getting what we were hoping for. Okay. So it's a bit of a challenge across the countries.
Thank you for that. And thank you to those who are sending their questions in. Kate Griggs, there's a question here from Samira Etisham, who writes, there is no support by the classmates to children with special education needs. Despite creating a lot of awareness, as a teacher, I can't create a culture of acceptance. What do you think teachers should do in that situation?
So I think it's really important. She's completely right. Having that support, peer support, is really important. A lot of what we do with our campaigns is around raising awareness, and we've got lots of resources for teachers and dyslexic kids as well to be able to advocate for themselves, to explain what dyslexia is. But that's really, really important, particularly as we know dyslexia is very much education. It's not a medical issue. It isn't something you medicate. It is down to how the teachers support those kids. And the self-perception that dyslexic children have is often their self-esteem goes down dramatically when they start school, because school is focusing on all the things that they struggle with and not putting any focus on the things that they're good at. So it is really important to create a whole school culture around dyslexia where the school, the classrooms, the kids, the dyslexic kids themselves and parents all understand dyslexia as this pattern of strengths and challenges, so we can support the challenges within school and make sure we're celebrating the strengths as well. And there's a lot in our teacher training, there's a lot around that to really help teachers to have that whole view of dyslexia, not just the fact we're not very good at passing exams and tests or spelling.
How important is early detection? Is it now more common for dyslexia to be identified early on in the classroom?
Sadly, I think the numbers of kids being identified with dyslexia are not increasing. We know from the UK that 80% of dyslexic children are leaving school without their dyslexia being identified. It's something that's very easy to hide. You can just hide behind being quiet and not making a spectacle of the fact that you can't do the work, which is very much who I was as a little sort of 7-8-year-old. It's quite easy just to go under the radar. And unless teachers know what to look for, it can just be kids that are not very smart or not very bright, not working very hard. So I think those numbers are not going up. It is really easy to spot dyslexic children if you know if you understand the sort of spiky profile. So we'll be really, really good at some things in the top percentile, but also very weak in others. So if you have a child in your classroom and you just don't quite get why they seem really bright and able, but they can't get their thoughts on paper, or their performance in other areas is just not matching up, look for dyslexia, because that's likely to be a dyslexic child.
Sam Pittis, let me bring you back in. Do you wish you'd been diagnosed earlier? Do you think that would have made much of a difference to your experiences at school?
Yes, I do. I think it's very difficult to sort of look back and, think about a counterfactual. My life is what it is, and I'm all right. But yes, I do think that school could have been different. Somebody said to me recently, an ADHD and autism expert said, the one thing we need to do in school is to make sure that children have a positive, fun experience that isn't traumatic. And, you know, you can learn all sorts of things in all different sorts of places as you go through life. But if you start off with a traumatic experience, actually that's a stumbling block before you've even, you know, started to make your way in life. So I think creating, yes, a challenging, but a warm, encouraging, fun experience in school, I think is so vital, because you're setting people up for the rest of their life. And I think, you know, what options might I have had? What things might I have been able to achieve or accomplish if I had known I had ADHD when I was younger? Who knows?
Thank you for that, Sam. A follow-on question related to what I asked earlier about how sometimes classmates of people who have special education needs, that they don't accept them, that there isn't this culture of acceptance in the classroom. Mehmet Celebi asked the question, what kind of activities can build a bridge between special education needs students and their peers in and out of the classroom? Cecilia Mezzanotte, what do you think about that?
I think that just normalizing the relationship makes a lot of the difference. So if you include all students in the same classrooms and context from the beginning, when they're very young, that can help develop relationships that are more positive for everyone. So if children are used to seeing children that are diverse from them, or they know that some of their peers are going to be struggling when there is a lot of noise and they're going to need to go to a separate room, or sometimes they don't want to play, they just want to wear their headphones because it's very intense for them to stay in that context. I think the playing parts in particular when they're younger can help a lot. And then later in life, what helps a lot for some of the groups of students with SEN is having small groups or peer activities. So when they're doing certain exercises, they need to solve them together. When they're helping each other and explaining each other certain concepts, that helps both the learning, because we know, for instance, for students with ADHD, the peer learning works very well compared to frontal instruction. But also they have a chance to socialize and spend time together and do their homework or their assignments all together. And that normally helps build the relationship quite a bit.
Thank you for that. There's another question, Cecilia, which I think you might be best placed to answer, which comes from Minimal Demal from Kids First in the UAE, who asks, how can neurodivergent children adjust to a typical classroom if their comprehension level is not the same as others?
I think that depends a lot on the structure of the education system and the supports provided. I think it's more of the role of the education system and the educators to help them adjust and help them get up to speed. That depends a lot on what their struggles are. So in certain cases, on certain types of special education needs, the children might need to have a reduced curriculum to work on. They will have different tasks or to be assessed on certain topics. In other occasions, it's more the role of the teaching assistants or support staff to make sure to bring the children up to speed, to make them comfortable to speak up, to make them comfortable to ask questions in the classroom and get support. So it's not really the role of the students to adapt to the classroom. What we say a lot when we work on inclusion is that the system really needs to go towards the students and help include them in our mainstream education systems.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I want to move the conversation along a little bit to discuss what could be done differently now. If there's things which you want policymakers to do, what would they be? Kate Griggs, what sort of skills should inclusive classrooms be nurturing that support children with special education needs?
I think certainly from a dyslexic child's perspective, we know now an awful lot more about dyslexic thinking skills. We know that 2 years ago in 2022, nearly 3 years ago, LinkedIn added dyslexic thinking as a skill. It is also in the World Economic Forum's recent report, the Skills for the Future report, the top 4 skills that every workplace is looking for align with dyslexic thinking skills. So complex problem solving, creativity, interpersonal skills, all of those things we know are really high up in dyslexic thinking skills. So I think it's important for schools to recognize that this sort of drill method of teaching and then testing is actually not fit for purpose, is not 100% not fit for purpose for dyslexic kids, but also for kids with ADHD and other special educational needs. But in all honesty, it's not fit for purpose for any child, because if we know that what the workplace is looking for are these soft skills or power skills, as they're beginning to be talked about, the skills that artificial intelligence can't do, then our school systems really need to move forward very quickly to make sure that isn't how we're assessing and testing our children. We put a report out at the UN General Assembly back in September called Intelligence 5.0. And the report looks across a whole different range of topics, and the importance of redefining intelligence and understanding the importance of different intelligences. But one thing that it does look at is actually getting artificial intelligence to take SAT tests and to take some of the standardized tests that we are measuring intelligence on in our schools, and AI is way better at those than any human. So we really need as a world to kind of have a bit of a wake-up call. Yes, today we're talking about inclusive education and special educational needs, but this is a lever and a trigger for a much bigger conversation around the importance of recognizing all kids as having diverse ways of thinking, and we have to be measuring and treasuring in a way that all of those kids can bring out their skills and their abilities. So it's a bigger conversation, but testing is a real problem for kids with special educational needs, and teachers really need to have the confidence to maybe do things differently and not just stick to those rigid measures as an understanding or a measure of how those kids are doing, performing, or their intellect.
Okay, thanks for that. Sam, I'd like to get your reaction to that. I know you speak to lots of ADHD experts about the current situation in schools. What strategies would you like to see come in to help teachers support special education needs in classes?
Well, I think I'd echo what Kate has said, and I think I talked about cultural change earlier. Talking about a contemporary example, a friend of mine who has ADHD has a 6-year-old who's just been diagnosed, and happy for me to talk about their experience. And it was sort of clear that she was struggling. She was being, distracted. So the parents went in, they advocated for her. The school actually were really receptive. They put a plan in place, and things like, having a cushion so that when she wiggled on her chair, it didn't disturb other children. Things like having fidget toys. There were measures like sending on errands so that she could get up and exercise and move around when she needed to. There was also a system whereby when she was learning to write, she would write a sentence, and then she'd put her hand up, it would be checked, and then she would write another one. And the idea behind that was essentially to reset her, because if she had to write 5 sentences in a row, she'd do a sentence and she'd start looking out the window. Now, those are all brilliant positive measures that can help someone with ADHD. But actually, turn it on its head, what that does is ask the question, what are we expecting of our children? What we're trying to do there is to take an ADHD creative brain and to conform it into a system whereby you have to sit still and you have to write out line after line after line. Now, if what we are saying is there is a fairly decent part of the population whose brains work differently, we need to serve them as well, and we need to help them thrive by changing the culture in school and our expectation of what children should be doing in school.
Cecilia Mezzanotte, you don't represent global governments, but you work for the OECD. What should governments do in reaction to Sam's point there?
I think I recognize a lot of the things that Sam mentioned. So a lot of countries have started to provide accommodations for students and also consider the space around them and how it can be organized to better respond to their needs and their characteristics, to try and include the students as much as possible. I saw that someone in the chat was talking a lot about the environment as well. And that it's an interesting point. So for Sam can probably talk about that a bit, but for students with ADHD, for instance, maybe being not in the center of the class with 25 other students around them, but being closer to the teacher or one side when they have less input, or being able to move around, or not being forced to stay at the desk working on the same task for 2 hours and having frequent breaks and being able to approach the task as they see fit can be a big support in the way that the assignment is going to fit their strengths and their preferences in their learning and their attitudes. So we know that countries are starting to work toward that. We also know that it's a struggle for teachers to do so when the system doesn't provide for that. So there is a big point on how countries design their accommodations for the learning and the teaching. And we are doing a piece now that is going to come out later this year that I forgot to mention in my slides. So it's going to be a policy brief on inclusive assessment. So on how assessment specifically can be made more inclusive. So instead of just thinking about the teaching and the learning part, so when we get to the assessment stage, are we including all students to do their best? And we are looking into how to do that, what are the accommodations that most countries provide, when modifications come into play. And that is an interesting conversation, I think, also to have. And we saw that a lot of countries are thinking critically about it and thinking about how they can ensure the quality and the validity of their certifications, but also ensure that everyone can access them so that the certificate is actually valid and really represents the skills and the knowledge and the abilities of all their students.
Okay, thank you for that, Cecilia. A question from Ali Durban, who says, I'm interested to hear the panel's views on the deficit narrative that society has created around children and young people with special education needs. So as I think this is a big part of the problem, especially around stereotypes. Kate Griggs, can I bring you in on this point here? How big an issue is stereotyping?
The language around special educational needs is really, really important that we change that. And again, it's having that focus on the things that kids with SEN are brilliant at, rather than really focusing on all the deficit and the deficit model. For dyslexic children, the power of language that we use with them is really transformative. Teachers can completely change the life of a child. It costs nothing just by understanding that dyslexia comes with these sort of superpowers and kryptonite, and we need to understand both of those and making sure that that runs through the school classroom, as we heard earlier. For a dyslexic child, I mean, I know my life was transformed by teachers who really got what I was struggling with and what I was good at, and just that reframing of saying it's a different way of processing information. It doesn't fit easily within the current mainstream traditional education setting, but it should do. But actually, our thinking is not being measured in the way and treasured in the way that it should be. And kids understanding that and being allowed to really flourish is really, really important. And it is transformational, not just for the dyslexic children, who will then be able to create the resilience and the perseverance they need to cope with their struggles, but also the peers around them who are able to really understand that they're brilliant at some things, but not good at others. There is definitely a lot we can do around that conversation of stigma, removing that stigma through language and a better way of communicating.
Very interesting indeed. A point was made on the chat relating to what you just said there. Kinia Pugh saying, should we talk about additional needs rather than special needs? This would help to address preconceptions. Another comment by Karen Kramer writes, children with special education needs have a greater challenge to maintain their self-esteem and motivation for school. And this is affected by the poor social emotional education of students and in some cases teachers. If we want to achieve good inclusion, shouldn't we prioritize skills such as empathy and resilience in children? Cecilia Mezzanotte, if I can bring you back in on this point, and it's slightly, I think it links to what Sam was talking about as well before, as well, about reorganizing education systems and their focus.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think a key point linked to the comments and also what Kate was mentioning, there is a big debate and reflection on the role of in it for both things. So if we do not label students, which is something that a lot of researchers also are striving for, to go beyond the labeling of special education needs and just recognize the needs of the students, or use terminology that leads to a lower stigma or identifying people as something other than us. But on the other hand, we also know that to some extent, it helps for students to be, as Sam was mentioning, at least to be diagnosed and see what their needs are and why certain things maybe are harder for them, or they feel like I'm not able to do this thing as other peers are, why I function this way and why do they not. So we see that that helps. But at the same time, that when you receive a diagnosis, sometimes your teachers are going to have a bias and they're going to expect less of you. And we see in research that there are some prejudices also in the teaching staff that still remain. So it's a very complicated discussion to bring forward. Ideally, though, we know that it would be better to at least not use the labels in classrooms. So let's not call students and say, yes, he has to do that because he has a special education need, or yes, he's going to do this because he's autistic. So the idea of recognizing their needs, we know why maybe they have certain needs and they need support in certain areas, but we try to keep that discussion away from the students so that they don't identify each other as needing something different for some reason. And in general, there is a big conversation about changing the whole thinking system within education to not identify special education needs with these terminologies, but just focus a lot on the needs. The problem there, from our perspective, is that when we work with education systems that still rely a lot on categories, if we take that away, if we take away the terminology, there is a risk that students will not be considered and they're not going to be receiving the support that they need. Because we know that the terminology and the whole work that has been done in identifying special education needs as a group of students in the past has brought a lot of changes, has brought them inside mainstream education along the years. So there is a process, I think, there, and we hope to go more and more towards a lack of specific terminology or labeling in the future, but they also play a role for how education systems are organized right now. Ideally, we'll progressively move on.
Get a comment from Joanna Warlow, which relates to this, saying we use the term additional learning needs rather than special education needs in Wales. She thinks that is a better term. Sam Pittis, go on, Cecilia.
Sorry, I just wanted to mention it's very interesting, and I know that Wales does that. I know that Portugal, I think also Scotland don't use labels anymore, so they just talk about the needs of the students and they try not to use the grouping at all. So we've seen a few examples from countries, and it's very interesting to hear more also about Wales.
Sam Pittis, if I can bring you in on this point, because you talked about earlier the relief of being diagnosed and knowing you had ADHD, but what about being labelled as having ADHD in schools? You obviously know pupils who are going through this at the moment. What sort of impact does that have?
I think it is a broad question, I think, as Cecilia said, because it's something that we debate a lot on our podcast, You're Wrong About ADHD, which is that currently a diagnosis is really helpful because we are, I keep talking about cultural change, but we are still, whether you are a child or an adult, essentially trying to say, I've got something wrong with my head and I need to manage it away so that I can conform to what society expects. The cultural change is starting from scratch and saying, I have a type of brain that is as valid as anybody else's, and it needs to be challenged, it needs to be stimulated, and it needs to be accepted. And it is difficult because we already have perceptions in school of, what's naughty behavior when children are being silly or are playing up, and all those kind of, those are all labels which can often be unhelpful, because whether you've got additional needs or not, there's usually a reason behind that behavior. And I'm not an educational specialist, and that is a wider conversation about how do you set boundaries in schools? How do you ensure that children do learn discipline and do learn to be prepared for the workplace, but also take into account why are they behaving like they're behaving, either because they've got additional needs or honestly because they're very bright and they're a bit bored. It's cultural change, but I think, as Kate said earlier, it's not just cultural change for people with additional or special educational needs, it's cultural change for all children.
Okay, thank you for that, Sam. Kate, I want to bring you back in. The question, it's not UK, it's not about the UK, and it's not about dyslexia, but I'm going to throw it to you anyway. Plamina Nikolova writes, how do you work with parents who deny the condition of the child and do not want them to be assessed and supported because they will be, inverted commas, marked for life. Apparently, this is a very common problem in Bulgaria.
I think it's quite a common problem in lots of countries, actually. We work globally, so we hear that quite a lot. I think this is all coming back to the cultural change point that Sam says. I mean, I am dyslexic. I learn differently. I process information differently. There's nothing wrong with my brain. It's different. It's not wrong. And I think that's what we need to be able to understand in schools. And there's lots and lots of amazing information on our website to really help teachers to be able to help parents to see the importance of identifying and understanding their child's different need or additional need. But just going back to the identification point, until we have a system that actually values the way everybody thinks equally, labels are so important, and it really concerns me that there is a shift away from labels. Certainly, I can speak for dyslexia, but not for other special educational needs. But I think Sam will probably agree that for a young person who is struggling at school, to understand the reason they are struggling is because they are dyslexic and they think and learn differently is absolutely empowering. And it's the thing that helps them to rebuild their confidence, to understand how they learn and persevere and succeed. So I think until we've changed the system, so it really values every single cognitive diversity, I think taking labels away is worrying. And I hope that isn't something that is becoming too much of a thing. Certainly it'd be something as a charity we would really push to make sure those kids are getting the understanding of how they think, because it's the trigger to really understanding yourself. I don't know what you think, Sam.
If I could just come on the end of that, I mean, the other part of that is the example I gave earlier of my friend's daughter, the really helpful school, the really helpful Senko, the special educational needs coordinator, said to the parents, you still need to get a diagnosis, because although we are on top of this, you will go through life and you will meet teachers who don't understand this, with the best will in the world, haven't got the awareness. You will come to schools and workplaces and environments where you are not met with the positive experience that you've had here. And so that label and that diagnosis is still important, because there are lots of people who don't understand this.
Okay, thank you so much for all of that. I'm going to move the conversation along again, because we've had quite a lot of questions come in about the impact on the rest of the class if there's so much focus on children who have special education needs. I know at the start, Cecilia said there's not much evidence of a negative impact on performance, but this is a question we are getting. So, for example, Samira Tisham from Pakistan writes, how can a teacher differentiate children with special education needs while also handling a class of, say, 26 other students? Cecilia, what do you think about that?
I think that's the biggest question that education systems are facing now. The teachers have limited resources. What it's important, I think, is that the entire system is organized to support them, to help the students. And it's normal. And then there are concerns from the families of students that do not have a special education needs, or maybe they don't have an immigrant background, or they don't receive additional language support because they're part of a linguistic minority. This is a discussion that is a bit broader than special education needs. It's about how we support all students within the classrooms without penalizing anyone. And a lot of that is about having some good examples, for instance, of team teaching. So having several teachers and professionals with specific backgrounds, specific expertise that work together in the classroom, having the resources that are given to the teachers to know how do you differentiate learning and teaching for the students that have different needs. So you recognize that the student has this challenge, they would be learning better in a different way. How do you adapt that? How do you assess them in a different way? And a lot of that cannot just be on the teacher. So it's the role of the educational system to provide the resources there and provide the material and provide additional stuff. Of course, it's complicated in a period where we are missing teaching staff. There are a lot of shortages around all OECD countries, more or less, and even more so for teachers that work a lot with students with special education needs, who tend to have a higher turnover because it's a hard and complicated job when they don't have the support. And there is also a piece about having the support of the school leaders. So a very important role in the inclusiveness of a school lays with the central authority or the school leader, the principal, and how supportive they are of their teachers to make sure that they have the resources, if they need support in certain areas, if they need more material to support certain students, or they need to bring in someone else from another classroom that is used to helping dyslexic students, and they know less about dyslexia. They maybe can bring teachers together and have shared expertise across the schools, share knowledge and share practices, and try to build a more sustainable system for everyone involved.
Thank you for that, Cecilia. Kate Griggs, the same question really for you. Sugra Chowdhury Khan from the Aga Khan Foundation has written, how does one attend to children with special education needs when you've got a large class and minimal resources?
I think one of the most important things to know is what is good for children with dyslexia, certainly, and I would think probably most special educational needs, is actually good for all learners. So I'll give you an example. Dyslexic people are really good at seeing the big picture. It's what makes 40% of entrepreneurs dyslexic and lots of incredible people dyslexic successful at what we do. One thing that's really important for a dyslexic learner is to have a big picture of what's happening in the lesson. So at the beginning of the lesson, the teacher needs to say, right, in this lesson, this is what we're going to be learning. This is what we want the outcomes to be. And just that overview of a lesson before it starts is transformational for dyslexic kids because they know where the focus needs to be. But that's good for all learners to actually know that that's the direction of travel of the lesson. Also, things like using different ways to provide information. So use videos for things, allow kids to present their work using videos rather than it all being written work, making sure you do certain things in small teams, so you break out during the lesson, so you have small groups doing things together, using technology. All of those things are really essential for dyslexic children, but they're actually good for all kids. So I think this sense that we have to do something special for this group that is going to be at the cost of the other students is actually completely wrong. It's just good, multi-sensory, interesting teaching that will support all learners, whether they're dyslexic or have special educational needs or not.
Pittis, I saw you nodding along there. Would you like to reflect on that?
Yes, I think I don't want to, sort of paint everyone with SEN, special educational needs, with the same brush. And obviously we're talking about different conditions. I can talk about me personally and my experience with ADHD. Honestly, if my teachers had an alternative approach to teaching me, then it probably would have been less disruptive, because I spent most of my time shouting out, putting my hand up, pushing tables around, irritating other children, just generally trying to entertain myself. So actually, if there had been some alternative stimulus, I think actually probably would have been less distracting for the class.
Are there some situations where inclusive classrooms aren't the best solution, where dedicated schools or classes for special education needs kids might serve the students better? Cecilia Mezzanotte.
I think if the inclusion is done properly in a way that it's resources are there, the capacity is there, and the system, there is stakeholder and there is awareness, and there is a cultural understanding behind why we're doing these, why the classroom is inclusive, and why everyone is in the same system, my answer would be no. So there is no reason, if this is done properly, to have students in a separate setting. I understand the needs in certain instances, in particular from the student and family side, to go to a system or to a different school or to a specialized setting that is more prepared and supporting. So if certain environments are formally inclusive, but in practice, they are not really addressing the needs of the students, and you're just there in a corner with a teaching assistant that doesn't really know how to support you with your needs, for the individual student, it might make more sense to be somewhere they get support. But I think the problem there is not the inclusion discourse per se, is lack of capacity and resources in a given system. And that's why I think there is still some concerns from families that come from systems that maybe had that issue. So maybe they started seeing people brought into their classrooms, or they had that experience and they weren't really supported, and the teachers didn't know what to do with them. So now they are very worried about their children and whether in this mainstream class they're going to be supported and they're going to do great and they're going to thrive and everything. And I imagine that for them it's difficult to see this happen, but I think working together to have everyone supported in an inclusive classroom so they can also develop their social and behavioral and emotional parts, because otherwise we're putting people in a separate small classroom. They always talk to the same 6 people that think exactly like them. No one, they don't see other people. And then when we get to the labor market or to our offices, we're not used to talking to people that think differently, they act differently from us.
Thank you for that. We're running a little low on time now, so I'm going to say thank you to all the people who've been sending in questions. One last question from Ekaterina Efemenko from the European Trade Union Committee for Education, who writes, how could AI be used for creating inclusive classrooms and what are the risks? Now, Kate Griggs, you mentioned technology earlier on, so I suppose you are probably the best placed person to answer this question. Over to you.
So AI for a dyslexic person just removes all of our barriers. AI is great at aggregating information. Dyslexic people are great at innovating with that information. So it literally has transformed our world. In education, it is the most exciting thing that's ever happened for dyslexic students because it will enable teachers to be able to personalize and differentiate learning and the classroom for dyslexic learners and other learners. So it's a very, very brilliant thing that is coming forward. There are also a lot of, there's reading coach that's being developed, math coach that's being developed both by Microsoft, lots of other tech companies are developing incredible tools that will be able to support kids. So it will eventually alleviate a lot of the difficulties that teachers are facing with differentiating and personalized learning. So it's a great thing to be happening. It's just we all need to obviously adopt it with care.
I'd like to get the panel's thoughts on what they'd like policymakers to do. If they can make one big change, what would they want policymakers to do to create a more inclusive classroom which supports children better with special education needs? Sam Pittis, if you were speaking to a policymaker now and they could make the changes happen, what would those big changes or that one big change be?
I think it would be looking at how we can make individuals thrive. Obviously, school is based on a collective experience, but people's brains work differently. So can we approach education by saying, look, there are some people who are good at this, there are others who are good at that. How can we get the best out of everybody rather than trying to make them conform? And I'm sure there are lots of people who work in education and say we are trying really hard to do that. And I understand there are lots of teachers doing great work. But if that's the focus, if that's the central point, how do we make individuals thrive? I think there's more to be done.
Cecilia Mezzanotte, what would you like policymakers to do?
I think that for me, a great step would be for them to conceptualize inclusion as key and horizontal throughout their whole education system. It's just not a niche of the work to try and support some students. It's something that concerns every student. Everyone benefits for a more inclusive education system that responds to their specific needs, but it needs to be incorporated throughout the education system. So from the governance, the resourcing, the capacity building, everything needs to be designed with inclusion in the back of their minds at all times. So to imagine an education system that is made to be inclusive and not just some areas where we try to bring people back in, I think would make a big difference from everyone in the system to be able to support everyone to thrive, as Sam was mentioning.
Thank you for that. And Kate Griggs, the final word for you.
I think it would be to recognize that special educational needs isn't special, it's mainstream. We know that 1 in 5 kids are dyslexic. If you add all of the other neurodiversities on top, it is a huge percentage of children in every classroom, and they can be served in an inclusive classroom and can succeed if the knowledge is in every single classroom. So every teacher needs to be trained to understand how to support kids with special educational needs within the classroom. Then we create a truly inclusive school system, but also inclusive society.
Okay. That's a nice way to end it. Thank you so much to Kate Griggs, CEO of Made in Dyslexia, Sam Pittis, co-host of the podcast You're Wrong About ADHD, and Cecilia Mezzanotte, OECD Policy Analyst. I think that was a fabulous conversation. I hope you agree. If you want to learn more about this topic, then there are absolutely loads of links in the chat. Before you shut off this Zoom call, make sure you click on them, and please do join us again. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks for watching. Thanks for sending your questions, and please do join us again soon for another OECD webinar. All the best.